What's up, everyone? This is the TinMan with the Worldwide Resistance Network. If you are watching this, you are the resistance. And welcome to TinMan TV. Yes, everyone, this is TinMan TV. I, of course, am your host, the TinMan, Chris Sheldon, here with the Worldwide Resistance Network, brought to you by the infamous Nut Monster Blue, the fictitious product that doesn't actually exist because we are of the people, by the people, for the people. So if you like this broadcast, by all means, share the live feeds, the retransmissions, all that fun shit. Like, follow, and subscribe on all our various social medias, YouTube, Rumble, X. Fuck up YouTube's algorithm by hitting that notification bell and just completely destroying their algorithm. And as always, check out our online store. Tons of great merch there. The new Ice merch there, including the fucking bitch t-shirt. And as always, you are as much part of the conversation as anybody else, so comments are enabled. Feel free to join in the conversation with your thoughts, opinions, and information. And on that note, let's get the ball rolling. Now, I am starting a little bit late today. Just kind of got caught up in some of the news. And I'm looking at Jones's feed for his broadcast right now. Says, Thursday Live, feds arrest 2 BLM organizers from Minnesota church attack. Now, I want to focus on that today because that's a big, big issue here. Because a lot of people are saying that it violates people's right to worship, religious assembly, and so on and so forth. But in contrast, and I know I'm going to get a lot of heat for this from the right, but it needs to be addressed. And that's my job, is I address the things that don't generally get addressed. And that is, what's the fucking difference between what happened in Minnesota and the sidewalk bacon incident in Florida? Like, seriously. Both argue freedom of protest, freedom of expression. The only difference I can really see is that the incident in Florida took place on a public street. Now, I'm kind of wondering why Muslims would be sitting there praying in the street instead of going to their homes or whatnot. I know whenever call to prayer happens, you got to stop what you're doing wherever you are and start praying. We actually had a security officer back when I was working in trailer security in California. He would not respond to alarms or any motion detections or any calls during his prayer time. Okay, they had their designated time for prayer, and no matter where he was, what he was doing, even if he was at work, the world fucking stops and he starts praying. And so I get where you have some Muslims who are probably praying wherever they were walking on the sidewalk and whatnot. But my question is, why were Christian protesters there? Like, they knew the Muslims were going to be there. They had the bacon already. Okay, now I may be missing some details here. But my point is, the right argued like a motherfucker because these people were arrested for harassment of the Muslims and their religious freedom. And they were citing freedom of expression. It was in a public place, yada, yada, yada. But then on the flip side, the right is going completely ape shit because anti-ICE protesters and BLM motherfuckers and all this shit came in and started protesting in a church service. Now, it could be argued public venue, public sidewalk, community property versus private property, which is owned by the church's founders and pastor and whatnot. So you could argue private property being the difference there, but as far as as far as both instances are concerned, is there really much of a difference outside of private property versus public property in terms of constitutional protest and freedom of worship? And this does beg to be asked because it is a double standard. And I'm surprised more people have not made this argument. In fact, I think I'm the first one that actually thought of this. And again, it begs that question. What the actual fuck is the difference? Again, outside of private property versus public property. I don't see much of a difference here. Now, we on the Worldwide Resistance Network's forums, such as the Roundtable, have discussed this quite a few times. And that is whether or not diversity, more or less religious diversity, can coexist in the United States. Can the United States be a melting pot of religious and cultural diversity? Or is it just opening the floodgates to prospective invasion and takeover, whether through incrementalism or hostile takeover? Now, a lot of people on the left sit there and make this argument that the United States is stolen land, it belongs to Native Americans, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard the argument. But here's the thing. It's not stolen land, it's conquered land. The United States is a conquered nation. Britain came in and conquered it, just like the Spanish came in and conquered the southern territories. British conquered the north, Spain conquered the south. And though the United States and Mexico, respectively, have declared their independence and fought for their independence against those varying parties, still, the Western continent, North and South America, Northern and South America, are conquered territories. They were conquered. There were people here. Those people were conquered. And it is now the United States, Mexico, and all other subsequent countries. But a lot of people still argue this dynamic, even though that's not the case. And I kind of think that's a distraction from the real issue is just because a nation was conquered once doesn't mean it can't be conquered again. Now, you have outside forces, such as people from the southern border of Mexico and all those southern countries, who came in during the Biden administration, many of which have been documented saying, along with many Muslims and Somalis, stating that they're here to overthrow the United States, to conquer it, to either make it Mexico or bring the country under Sharia law. The Somalis are saying that this land was promised to them several thousand years ago, even though, according to history, we didn't even know this fucking land existed until 1492. Now, there's probably a lot of argument in terms of skewed history and lost history in regards to that, but as far as the official declaration goes, the Somalis didn't have the means of traveling to the Western continent. Okay, their primary focus was Africa and running piracy and slave trade within their respective region. They were not in any way involved in what was going on here, and probably didn't know about this place until Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1792. So to make that argument is absolutely a farce, but it doesn't take away from the reality that Minnesota and that whole subsequent area and Minneapolis has been taken over by Somalia, by the Somalian culture, primarily. It is not a farce to say that many areas have implemented their own version, even if it's not legal, of Sharia law within their respective communities operating within the United States. It would be an outright lie to say that sleeper cells that have been warned against for decades don't exist, whether they be Muslim, Somalian, or Latino in origin. Okay, we know these things exist. We know these are absolute factors. So we must accept the reality that the United States, as it exists now, exists because this land was conquered by Britain and subsequently liberated by the colonials. And it is safe to say that no country on this planet is subject, or exempt, I should say, from being conquered by somebody else. That's primarily the argument of why we have had fluoride in the water and why these cultural ideologies want men dumbed down and want the people dumbed down and stupid and complacent, and turning men from strong masculine men and alpha males into weak submissive beta males, so that they're easily conquered and subverted. Okay, to ignore this reality is to live in a perpetual state of denial. And just because you bury your head in the fucking sand doesn't mean the rest of your body isn't exposed and that the lion ain't going to eat your ass. Okay, so it has to be addressed here. It has to be looked at the broader perspective here. Going back to the church issue, can the United States or any country be a melting pot of cultural and religious diversity? Or does it face eventual takeover and annihilation? Will that pre-existing culture be subverted as a result of ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity and inclusion? And I know that some of my co-hosts don't like to really get into it and think that we can coexist. And in many regards, maybe people can, if they can willingly put aside and compromise. And what I mean by compromise is become laxed on their cultural, ethnic, and religious standards, such as Sharia law. Sharia law is a fundamental principle in the Muslim and Islamic theologies. So, to have constitutional law and Sharia law in terms of religion cannot coexist. If you have a religious culture that says you have to adhere to Sharia law and no other law, then you cannot acclimate to the laws and the culture of another country. You just can't do it. If you are living in a constitutional republic and your religious theology demands that you adhere to Sharia law, then that's a contradiction of your theology and you're not living your theology. And ergo, you cannot have true freedom of religion because you are not permitted to exercise your religious belief. Now, many people have pointed out that the Muslim faith and Islam is an occupational religion. Their whole philosophy is to move to an area, establish influence and dominance, and eventually circumvent the culture and religion of that area and expand throughout that area until the entire region is subverted. That's been a part of the culture since its inception. And there's no denying that. And that is a part of their religious system. So again, it has to be asked. And I'm not saying that Christianity or Judaism isn't the same, because they are. Okay, Christianity is an expansionist culture. You know, a little religious movement that started in Rome and Jerusalem and the then Israeli territories quickly over the course of 2,000 years have encompassed the world one way or another. And so Christianity is really no different in that regard in terms of it being an expansionist culture. So we can't say one is good and one is bad. We can't praise one and condemn the other here. We just got to accept it for what it is. Both Christianity and the Muslim faith, as well as many others, are expansionist ideologies. Whether you want to admit it or not, that's a fact. And I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying it is what it is. Now, the question has to be, again, can the United States be a melting pot of cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity and coexist? The answer, sadly, is no. Now, we used to be a Christian nation. Back when this country was first founded, it was founded on the principles of religious freedom. And not just any religious freedom, but specifically the right to worship God, Jehovah, Jesus Christ, however you saw fit. You had the freedom to worship God. Not Allah, not Muhammad, not Krishna, not Buddha, but God, Yeshua, Jehovah, Jesus Christ. That was the whole principle. Coming here to worship Jesus Christ however you wanted. So it was a Christian nation built on the principle of worshiping God, Jehovah, Jesus Christ, however you saw fit. It wasn't a country of religious freedom. It didn't become how we transition from one to the other is a result of the things that happened throughout human history, such as the Salem witch trials, the upcoming of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and the subsequent persecution of the saints throughout the early years of that church's inception. Okay, events like this is what led to the Reformation, for lack of a better term, from worshiping God however you want to freedom of religion. Okay, because the witches had to have a right to worship, and the Mormons had a right to worship, even though Christians debated that the Mormons weren't actually Christian. Okay, it's just worshiping God however you wanted, but that's an entirely separate issue. But my point is, because of these religious clashings and the backlash that followed, society said religious freedom as a whole. You have the right to worship however and whatever you want within reason. Now, that reason is, you can't do human sacrifices, you can't do animal sacrifices, and your laws of your culture, such as Sharia law, are null and void here in the United States. You're free to worship whatever God you want, however you want, within certain limitations. And through those limitations, Christianity has been subverted. Christianity has been pushed out of the courthouse. It has been pushed out of schools, and so on and so forth. But yet, we have to allow Muslim prayer rooms in schools because they, according to Sharia law and their beliefs, no matter what they're doing, wherever they are, what they're doing, when the call to prayer happens, they have to stop whatever it is they're doing and pray right then and there. Okay, so we have a double standard. And one is always going to overlap and circumvent the other. It's just a natural way of life. Okay, if you remove God from schools, there's going to be that space. And eventually that space is going to be filled by somebody else. Somebody who's not as passive in terms of their ideology and cultural acceptance as Western Christian society has become. So ergo, the weaker species, the weaker culture gets subverted and eventually overtaken. It's a natural phenomenon. It's not even something that you would say, I don't know if you would say that it's a deliberate thing, although it probably is deliberate in many regards. But what I'm trying to say is it's a natural function of societies and human nature. It's just a natural force of nature, for lack of a better term. Okay? The weak tend to follow the strong, and the strong tend to rule over the weak. Now, if Christianity has become, quote, weak and complacent and very passive and going, okay, you can have the courthouses, you can have the schools, who's to say that the Muslim who are very firm in their beliefs aren't going to come in and say, okay, fine, we're taking over, motherfucker, what you going to do about it? Okay? Isn't that why Andrew Tate for the longest time was saying that he was a Muslim and following this Islamic faith, because it's not that he didn't believe in Christianity, but he respected the strength of the Muslim and Islamic theology and their unwavering devotion. It's like, hey, you talk shit about my God, I'm gonna whoop your ass and even kill you. Whereas Christianity has become very passive aggressive to the point of just being passive. Right? Jesus Christ is disrespected left and right. Whereas if it were this culture bashing on Islam or Muhammad or Allah, the Muslim community would be in an uproar and ready to go to war. Okay? And that's why Andrew Tate respects the Islamic culture more than the Christian culture, because Christian culture has become a pacifist little bitch. And Islam is not a pacifist little bitch, and both of which are expansionist cultures by nature. And again, it's just a natural phenomenon that occurs, that the weak follow the strong and submit to the strong. And at which point it has to be asked, if Christianity was willing to allow themselves to be pushed out of schools and churches, and not churches, courthouses, and even in the communities, is it really a surprise that Islam moved in when they are so firm in their beliefs and are willing to fight and die for them? And we're not? I mean, again, so it just becomes the question now of, what do you do in a situation like this? What has to be done if you are not willing to submit to Islam or any other takeover of cultural or religious ideology? At which point you have to become firm in your theology. You have to say definitively that this is a Christian nation, and God's going to be in the courthouses, in the schools, and in the culture, and it has to be a Christian community with the right to worship God however you want, versus this passive ideal of a religious and cultural melting pot. Because one culture and one ideology is always going to try to subvert the other. So if you don't want to be subverted, you have to take a firm stance and say, we're not giving any leeway. It's not even a matter of, you've been given this much and we're not letting you go any further. It's like, no, you're just not gaining any headway, period. God is in the schools, God is in the courthouses, God is in the community, period. And this is, the United States was founded on the idea of worshiping Jesus Christ however you want it, and that's where it sits. You don't like it? Go back to your Islamic countries, go back to your Buddhist countries, go back to your Hindu countries, go back to your Islamic countries, go back to your Jewish countries. Okay? Christianity isn't tolerated in Islamic cultures for the most part. You hear about some areas where Christianity is now being taught, but for the most part, these ideas are very firm. You go to Japan or China, their religious theology is locked and loaded. Okay, this is the theology of the land. The Muslims' theology of the land is Islam and Sharia law. Same in many regards in India and other areas. Okay, it is the religious ideology is as much a part of the culture as the law of the land. and the governance. But you've had a separation of church and state, removal and subsequent removal of religion from, and specifically Christianity, from churches and, or not churches, why do I keep saying churches? From schools and courthouses. And again, a lot of that had to do with what happened with the Salem witch trials and the persecutions of the Mormons, or the Latter-day Saints as they are correctly called. But it also has to do with religious theologies clashing within the government. And it has to be argued. So instead of finding a common ground where the Catholics weren't arguing with the Protestant movement, and the Protestant movement wasn't fighting with the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, blah, 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 and one ideology trying to overlap the other, the government just said, okay, we're getting religion out of government, ergo out of government institutions such as courthouses and public schools. But then Muslim prayer rooms move in. So what do you do? Where do you find the common ground of saying, okay, if we don't want our religion and our culture and even our country and our laws to be overridden and conquered by another, how do we affirm and take a firm stance on our culture, take back our ground, and also maintain a mutual understanding and, I say, of finding a way of coexisting with varying Christian denominations coexisting within the government, and subsequently coexisting with others without ideologies clashing? That's where this big question comes in, because it can't just be a Christian nation, because then what defines Christianity? At which point you're going to have infighting between the Catholics, the Protestant movement, and the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, you're going to have, and I say Protestant movement loosely because everything that's because the Protestant movement was the off-branching of Catholicism, which led to the Protestants, Lutheran, Baptist, Methodist, so on and so forth. Okay, so we just say the Catholics, Protestant movement, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, these are kind of your four little clubs here. You could maybe include the Church of Scientology. I wouldn't know if you would consider that part of the collective fold, considering their cultural influence, especially in Hollywood and government and whatnot, mostly Hollywood. But I digress. You know what I'm getting at there. I'm not going down that damn rabbit hole. But can these ideologies find a way to coexist and run the country without their ideologies getting in the way? Yeah, can they find a common ground to coexist and work together? And can it be established in this nation that it is a Christian nation that allows for religious diversity within their communities, but it's still a Christian nation? Can you have that? Can these worlds coexist? Can you establish a mutual ground where it's definitively a Christian nation that allows for religious diversity, but it's going to be maintained an unwavering stance in terms of its laws, culture, and religious heritage? Or do you just say, okay, this is the theology. This is a Christian nation. All Muslims, Buddhists, and Jews get the fuck out. And at which point do you just go back to how do you circumvent the infighting? What are we going to do here? It's such a convoluted issue. And this religious diversity. Oh, I think the Bible means this. I think the Bible means that. Okay? Do you have to reach a point of saying, okay, there needs to be one definitive religious theology. There needs to be one Christian ideology. There needs to be one Muslim ideology. There needs to be one Jewish ideology. And let's not mince words. They have their differing denominations in their respective religions as well. Judaism, I think, has 4 different denominations now. Islam has at least 2 that I know of. Okay, so it's not just culture, it's not just religious ideologies, Christian versus Muslim versus Jew versus whatever. It's all these Christian theologies and all these Muslim theologies and all these Jewish theologies and all that theologies, blah, 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 blah. You have all these differing denominational theologies that have led to this cultural melting pot to where Christianity itself is become a second-rate citizen and is being circumvented. So the question is, what can you do? Can we coexist here? Now, as far as the law goes and what happened in Minnesota in contrast to what happened in Florida, what happened in Florida was on a public street. I highly question as to whether or not it was actually planned that way, because who knows where Muslims are going to just stop and pray? Like, how do you determine that unless it was predetermined? How do you just randomly show up there with a shit ton of bacon, knowing where these people were going to be praying? Okay, I got a lot of questions there. And as far as these people showing up in a church goes, that is private property. That's an enclosed building. That's not a public street. So you have the issue of private property versus public property that comes into play in terms of these 2 issues. Now, both of which were freedom of expression, freedom of speech, right to protest, right to worship, blah, blah, blah. All these things are factors here. Okay, the arguments that are being made for what happened in Minnesota are not unwarranted. Okay? The only difference between that, the only tipping point, is whether or not it was a public place or not. This was a private church, privately owned, enclosed, wasn't open to the public. Whereas what happened on the street was, it wasn't a designated place of worship. It was a public street. And ergo, what happened, happened. But my question is, what will be the defining factors in regards to these 2 cases? Now, you have arrests that have already been made. Like I pointed out, the Alex Jones show. 2 BLM people have been arrested in connection to this endeavor. But we have to then make the argument, and that becomes an argument of, okay, if we're arresting these people for interfering with a church service, because it's private property, why is it then wrong to arrest the bacon eaters in Florida for disrupting a Muslim call to prayer? Okay, it is freedom of religion and a freedom of expression in both regards. The Muslims have their right to worship. The protesters there and the bacon eaters have a right to protest and whatnot. But I guess the only difference is, what happened in Minnesota was a private venue. I don't know. There's a lot of convoluted issues here, and I would definitely like the audience to really just chime in on this and give some thought and insight into this, because I really don't know what to think about this in terms of the law in regards to both of these issues. Like, where is one okay but the other is not? Okay, and at which point, who do you side with in terms of the law, or is it just a religious or cultural bias? Okay, I guess you would have to say definitively that though you have the right to protest and whatnot, you do not have the right to interfere with the worship of another group of people, especially in a private venue. And the same can be said for what happened in Florida. You have the right to protest. You have a right to worship however you want. You have the right to preach in the street. But you don't have the right to interfere with how somebody else is worshiping. And in both cases, that's what happened. And that's why people are now being arrested. People got arrested in Florida because they were interfering with the Muslim call to prayer, their right to religious assembly, and their right to worship. Direct interference of their right to worship. You have a right to worship, you have a right to protest, but you don't have a right to interfere with somebody else's right to assemble, worship, or protest. And that's what happened in both instances. So we do see a lot of bias from the right, and especially in terms of talk show hosts who are saying, what happened in Florida was wrong. Those people shouldn't have been arrested, blah, blah, blah. But then are calling for the arrest of what happened to the people that interrupted the church service in Florida. It's a hypocrisy. It is a hypocrisy. Okay? Like is now being pointed out, you do not have the right to interfere with somebody else's right to worship. You have the right to worship. You have the right to assemble. You have the right to peaceful protest. But you do not have the constitutional right to circumvent somebody else's constitutional right. At which point it now becomes an issue. It's not an issue of law, because the law is absolute. It now becomes an issue of cultural and religious tolerance. And at which point it now must be asked. It goes back to the issue of who's going to be the top dog, where Christianity has been complacent for so long and has allowed for the Islamic culture to take and establish a strong foothold. Okay, is this going to be a land of religious diversity, inevitably subverted into Islam or any other domineering culture that is more aggressive in their theology and firmer in their faith in the most literal sense than Christianity has been? Or is it going to be Christianity going to be pushing back and saying no more and then taking back their ground? And at which point, where does it go from there? And where do you after taking back your ground, where do you draw the line and say, okay, this is how it's going to be. This is what it's going to be, and this is how it's going to be. What is the line you're going to draw on the sand here? Are you going to be a cultural melting pot that is firm in its foundation, in its Christian foundation, or are you going to say that it's a Christian nation that allows for the freedom of religion, but is primarily a Christian nation and not a right to worship however you want? Or is it going to be a strictly Christian nation and everybody else needs to fuck off and go home? This is where the rubber meets the pavement here. And this is the question we as a nation need to face, because we are in a turning point in this country and in the world where the globalist system is pretty much dead. The globalists are admitting they're dead. Trump went to the World Economic Forum and basically told them they're dead. He had a good 45-minute speech there yesterday. I'm not going to get into all that. That's already been covered and beaten to the ground. But the globalist system is dead. It's trying to hang on, and it's trying to go for its last scare, and it's in a horror movie type scenario. But the globalist system is dead. The globalist New World Order system is dead. Now, many people would argue that that was the Antichrist system, and that inevitable history has been delayed for a time, but has it? Because you can then argue, what's going to take the place of this system? The way things currently are didn't work, so it needs to be torn down and replaced with something else. Okay, that's the whole premise of the Great Awakening, as Jones had pointed out in his book. A great read. I highly recommend it. We definitely give people a lot of insight and understanding in terms of what's happening on the world stage and what Trump is allegedly trying to do, and what the MAGA movement that Trump rode in on, because MAGA is not Trump's. He just rode in on that wave. Okay? It is the 1776 movement, the Great Awakening movement, that people like myself and Jones and so many others have been pushing for years. So I highly recommend, those who don't understand what's going on and just kind of want to sit there and play left versus right and many people go Orange Man bad and all that. I would seriously suggest reading The Great Awakening by Alex Jones. It's a great read. Even if you don't like him or support your broadcast, it's good to get an insight and an understanding of where we are at in terms of this cultural and political arena and the turning point that we are in human history. And again, it becomes the question of, what are we going to replace the New World Order system with? Is it going to be a utopia? Is it going to be a constitutional republic, getting back to what this country was initially supposed to be when the Founding Fathers created it? What are you going to do in terms of these political parties and their inability to work together? Republican versus Democrat. What's going to be done there? What is to be done to prevent the takeover of an Islamic State and the Muslim Brotherhood and Sharia law? And to what degree is this going to be a Christian nation in contrast to a nation of religious, cultural, and ethnic diversity, if it's even going to be that? But what kind of a future are we going to build here? And how is it not only going to be built, but how is it going to be maintained? Because, and this is one grievance that I've pointed out before, and a lot of people are starting to really point it out, is that the Communist Party, which is pretty much the forefront of the New World Order system, it's communism, for lack of a better term. That's why all these Democrats ascribe to socialism and communism, because that's the globalist order that was the most popular model. And was the model that the Jewish community helped create. Yeah, I said it. Jews! Yes, communism was started by the Jews. Okay, read your fucking history. Why do you think Adolf Hitler went apeshit? Okay, not a fan of Adolf Hitler. What he did was very bad, but if we understand history, we understand. We don't necessarily have to agree with why Hitler did it, but we can understand why he did it. And we can prevent that from happening again and prevent history from repeating itself. Because we don't need to get stupid about shit. Okay? So I'm not anti-Jew. I'm not pro-Hitler. I'm just pro-humanity and pro-understanding human history. Communism was a system created by the Jewish community, brought into the and has been brought into the United States, and that was the globalist world order system. Now, that's pretty much failed. Okay, because people are wising up. They don't want it. They don't want coffin apartments. They don't want 10-minute cities. They don't want to live in a society where they own nothing and are happy. Fuck that. Okay, people aren't down with that. And Trump's out and out said, we're not down with that. That's not what the United States is going to be. Get fucked. Okay, he pretty much said that for 45 minutes yesterday. And he said it many times prior. So again, read The Great Awakening if you don't understand what's happening and why it's happening. Read The Great Awakening. And before that, read The Great Reset. Read that. Again, another great book by Alex Jones. Okay, you don't have to necessarily like the guy, but the guy knows his shit. Okay, the guy knows his shit. And if you want to have a better understanding or broader perspective of how we got to this point and what's going on and why, read those two books. Read all three of his books. The 9/11 Descent into Tyranny, The Great Reset, and The Great Awakening. Read them. It'll give you perspective. And at which point you're then caught up to a great deal more of the rest of us and are ready to sit there and have the conversation of, okay, this system no longer serves the interests of the people. We're pumping the brakes on this bullshit, but what are we going to replace it with? Can the United States be a melting pot? Can religious, cultural, and ethnic ideologies coexist in a predominantly Christian nation? Can it be a melting pot? Can it be a Christian nation that allows for religious diversity? Or does it necessarily just have to be Old Testament? We follow God, everybody else get the fuck out and stay the fuck away from us. Okay? These questions have to be asked. And we have to decide as to what kind of a future we want. And in order to do that, we have to understand not only where we are, but where we came from and how we got from point A to point B before we could ever even consider trying to move on to point C. But in hindsight, I think we're about done here, ladies and gentlemen. So let's just go ahead and put the bird in the oven, shall we? Because there really isn't nothing much else to say. It's really in our hands as to what kind of a world we want, what kind of a future we want. And we got to be willing to put aside our cultural differences and political bias and look at the system for what it is and how we got to this point before we can even attempt to move forward and make something new. And on that note, I'm just going to leave it here. So if you've enjoyed this broadcast, share the retransmissions from X, YouTube, whatever. Again, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of our varying social medias. Follow us on X, YouTube, Rumble. Look up YouTube's algorithm by hitting the like and subscribe buttons, as well as that notification bell to get notified whenever we go live. Check out our online store. Tons of great merch with new merch coming out all the time. And as always, keep the conversation going. I know it's kind of been a dead day today. You know, I'm sure the weather has a lot to do with that. And I'm going to put it out there. Should we go back to Mondays and Tuesdays afternoons after the Alex Jones show? Because I really don't want to interfere with his shit. Or do you guys like the morning broadcast? In fact, I'm going to put a poll on X and see what times people best want us to broadcast. Because I like having my weekends, but there are times where things during the work week get convoluted for me. I'm off Mondays and Tuesdays, but there are times where I'll have to call in, and we're actually facing severe weather here. So if I'm at work, I'm going to be stuck at work if people can't come in, because the type of job I do has to have somebody to come in and replace. You don't just get to go home at the end of your shift. Your replacement has to come in, because we're first responders. So if your replacement doesn't come in, you're on shift until such time that your replacement can get in. And we're facing some pretty bad weather coming up here Saturday and Sunday, and maybe even Friday as well. So if we don't get to do a roundtable on Saturday because of the weather and me being trapped at work, we will do a roundtable on Monday or Tuesday. We'll announce that. But as far as a definitive schedule, considering the Friday dessert has pretty much been dropped, I want to get everybody's feel on what they feel is best in terms of when the podcast should be aired. So look for that on X. And in the meantime, this has been Chris Sheldon with TinMan TV and the Worldwide Resistance Network. If you're watching this, you are the resistance.